Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 12. Home is where you are. For the first half of the flight, the three of them sit in a tense, awkward silence, Peter staring at the window, Steve staring at Bucky glancing between the two. It's impossible to ignore the disapproving look on Steve's face every time his gaze shifts to Bucky's prosthetic still draped securely across Peter's chest, his eyebrows drawn together like he's watching someone litter in public and can't do anything about it. Bucky figures that he doesn't owe the man any explanations, and even if he did, there's no reason that conversation has to happen right this minute in front of Peter. If Steve's gotten it into his head that Bucky shouldn't use his left arm at all, just because of the people who gave it to him, he probably won't be happy to hear that Bucky no longer shares the same deep-seated hatred for it that he does. He's more than content to just let Steve stew in his thoughts and only focus on keeping Peter calm and grounded for the remainder of the flight. But then the kid starts shifting in his seat, his legs crossing and pressing together tightly. Bucky turns his head to look down the aisle toward the back of the plane, and then lifts his arm slowly as he tells Peter,
"There's a bathroom in the back, by the side there. See it?"
Peter turns his head and sees the sign and nods. Is it safe to get up?" Bucky smiles.
"Yeah, it's only when we're lifting off or landing that you're supposed to be strapped in. Mid-flight's okay."
He moves his legs out of the way as Peter stands up, sees his hands trembling as he steps into the aisle.
"You want me to take you back there?"
"I'm okay," Peter says quietly, sounding anything but. "Be right back." And then he slowly and carefully wobbles to the back of the plane and shuts himself inside the bathroom. Steve clears his throat the second they're alone. "He seems really nervous. First time on a plane?"
"Yeah,"
says Bucky, his chest aching in sympathy for the kid, knowing what awful things must be filling his head right now. "Was he born here?" Steve asks, something off in his voice, not quite matching the words as he says them, like he's really asking something completely different. Bucky eyes him, but answers all the same.
"Born and raised in New York."
Then Steve blows his mind. "Was she a Hydra agent?" Bucky blinks, not even remotely understanding the question at first. His face twists with confusion.
"What?"
Steve looks almost as uncomfortable as Bucky feels. "His mother, was she a Hydra agent?"
"No, why would you..." "Oh."
The realization clicks in his head like a light switch, Bucky's face flushing slightly at the confused look Steve gives him. Of course the man is totally lost.
"It's been a pretty long time since I've thought about him as anything but my kid, but Peter and I aren't biologically related."
Steve's face falls, and then an alarming number of different emotions take over his expression: incredulity, disbelief, and then anger. "Booker, you're telling me..." "Wait, please tell me this isn't what it sounds like."
"What does it sound like?"
Steve outright glares at him. "It sounds totally irresponsible, not to mention crazy. Bucky, be reasonable. You can't just take children in because you want them. Where did he even come from?" Bucky tries to take hold of the defensive anger that bubbles up in him, but he can't keep the harshness out of his voice as he replies,
"He came from an abusive and negligent foster home. And not that it's really any of your business, Steve, but I didn't take him. He followed me because he was alone and had nobody else, so I've been taking care of him. He's family to me now."
Steve's face softens, but the expression that takes over makes Bucky's stomach drop. In place of the anger and the confusion, Steve looks at him with eyes that are so placating that they feel condescending. "Buck," he starts, tone gentle, like he's speaking to a wounded animal. "Look, I'm not questioning that you care about him, don't get me wrong. But you have to realize this whole situation is insane. Peter can't stay with you. He isn't yours." There have been times in the past when Bucky's wanted to hit Steve. He knows that. But those times were mostly the result of Steve being completely reckless or just plain suicidal. This isn't that. The urge that wells up in Bucky now, he knows without a shadow of a doubt that this is the first time he's ever wanted to hit Steve because he feels threatened. It's the most ridiculous thing he's ever heard, the notion that Peter isn't his, after everything they've been through, after the thousands of hours Bucky spent working alongside Frank to keep food in his kid's belly and a roof over his head, after Bucky forced himself to do things for Peter he couldn't find the strength to do for himself. How can Steve say Peter isn't his after Bucky conquered a mountain of traumas born of almost a century of torture for Peter's sake? How can he say Peter isn't his after Peter gave up the only thing that mattered to him, the ability to be Spider-Man and save lives, just to stay with Bucky? How can he not see that just because he doesn't have a fucking piece of paper that says so, he and Peter are closer than most fathers and sons could ever hope to be? Then again, Steve's only known about Peter for a few hours, and it's not like their dilapidated apartment exactly screamed warm and cozy. Still, though, while Bucky understands the man's doubt, it doesn't make his own reply any less biting.
You have nothing to say about it, he says slowly, rage dripping off of every word. Not about me, and not about my kid.
Steve opens his mouth to reply, but closes it again as the door to the bathroom opens at the end of the aisle, and Peter slowly walks back, looking pale and flushed and zapping Bucky's anger out of him instantly. Bucky holds out his hands to steady the boy as he sits back down, and Peter doesn't wait for an invitation before he's leaning against Bucky's side again, curling up on his seat and letting his dad take the weight of his trembling, anxious body completely. Steve watches as Bucky gently rubs the kid's back and soothes him, lulling him enough that Peter can fall into a light, fitful sleep, and thankfully chooses to keep the rest of his ignorant comments to himself. Bucky's sure he learns all he needs to know about Tony Stark by seeing his definition of a quaint family cottage. There's nowhere on the property for the plane to land, so it touches down on a nearby golf course driveway, which Bucky suspects the man privately owns, where a car is waiting for them to take them the rest of the way to the cottage. He expects some small cabin on a lake somewhere, but as the car journeys down a long, well-maintained road, the houses only grow more extravagant. Or rather, their front gates do. All the actual buildings are backed onto properties too far behind the trees to see, but their gated driveways only become more and more unnecessarily fancy, each one named like their public property. The Tito Gardens, the Carrington Manor, a large, eye-catching, hand-painted sign that reads Pegasus Trail Rides with a bronze statue of a horse rearing beneath it, and finally the Stuck Family Estate. The car stops to wait for the automatic gate to slide open, and then it's pulling up the driveway, a road so ridiculously long that it's another 2 minutes before it pulls up in front of a large building. Peter actually sits up when the car stops, ungluing himself from Bucky's side for the first time since they disembarked from the plane. Both of them stare wide-eyed at the large mansion that towers over them, an absolutely gigantic building surrounded by an immaculately manicured lawn, complete with a perfectly laid cobblestone path and an ivory fountain at the base of the stairs. It's so outrageously garish that Bucky half expects every piece of furniture and decor inside to be made of solid gold. And he has no idea how Stark could look at this house, this ridiculously ornate, and think of it as a cottage. It's almost as large as Peter's school, and that thing holds 1,000 people during the week. As they step out of the car, he and Peter step a little closer to each other in the mansion's shadow, daunted. Steve steps up beside Bucky, and he looks as detached as Bucky feels, eyeing the building with a hint of exasperation visible in his furrowed eyebrows. And then the large double doors open, and Peter clenches his fist in the back of Bucky's shirt beneath his jacket as Tony Stark steps onto the porch and observes them. If you guys are done gawking at the outside, maybe consider actually coming in so you can gawk at the inside instead. He turns to go back inside, then stops and looks at Steve. Rhodey doesn't want to stay, so you can go ahead and leave Sam in the car. Rhodey will take him home. Steve turns and looks at Sam through the window, who nods, so he turns back to the house and follows Bucky and Peter into it. The inside is exactly as lush as the outside led them to believe, and the only quality of this entire place that is at all cabin-like is the dark earthy tones everything has, from the flooring to the furniture. Even the paintings on the wall are tastefully painted lakes and landscapes, all nicely complementing the bronzes and dark browns of the hardwood floors and leather upholstery. Peter's got a look on his face half between excited and scared shitless, but he doesn't say anything, following close behind Bucky as they move from room to room while Stark tours them around. Bucky doesn't say anything either, concentrating on committing the place's floor plan to memory just in case, until they pass by the fourth set of balcony doors so far, and Bucky can't help but ask,
How exactly are you going to put this place into lockdown?
Stark doesn't even turn his head, just continues walking. AI! He responds blandly with an idle wave of his hand, completely bored. The entire house and the grounds are all being monitored by my AI Friday. Say hi, Friday. Hello, says a gentle female voice from above. Bucky looks up and eyes the ceiling warily, looking for the speakers and cameras, but Peter quietly gasps and fixes his gaze on a tiny black square in the patterned wallpaper, his anxiety forgotten for a moment. That's so cool, he quietly says, gaze locked on the little black square. Bucky distantly wonders if he was able to find it so quickly thanks to his heightened senses, or if he really does just have that much of an eye for tech. Probably both. Hi, Friday. I'm Peter. Hello, Peter. The AI replies smoothly, somehow sounding pleased, which is eerie to Bucky in a deeply unsettling way. Welcome to your new home. Please let me know if there is anything I can do to assist you. Peter's excited face falls at the words new home, and he glances back at Bucky with a tense and nervous expression. But Bucky's gaze is locked on the back of Stark's head, who swivels around to face them and chuckles nervously, tapping the band around his wrist firmly with his fingers. Okay, Friday, that's enough. Mute. There's a beat of awkward silence between them before Stark swiftly and smoothly begins the tour again. The house is huge, but most of it is open. A few walls separate the kitchen, the dining room, the main living room. It's excessive in ways Bucky can't really comprehend. The man stops when they pass a dark staircase with a closed door at the bottom, presumably leading to a basement. That down there is my lab, Stark says, and neither him nor Bucky miss the way Peter's head perks up at the word. It's small, nothing like the one at home, but there is some decent tech down there. He smiles at Peter, and the look of excitement he gives his son makes Bucky's hackles raise protectively. I'll show you sometime. Before Bucky can tell the man to back the hell off, Peter eagerly asks, Really? With wide, hopeful eyes, his discomfort from earlier apparently forgotten. Bucky doesn't have the heart to forbid him, even when Stark's smile widens, and he says, Sure, kiddo. Seemingly about to reach out and ruffle Peter's hair. But he catches the look Bucky gives him, and he drops his arms immediately and turns around to carry on the tour. He knows the heated glare he keeps pointing at Stark's back is unsettling, since the man keeps a sizable distance between them for the rest of the tour, not even speaking to Bucky directly until they reach the hall of bedrooms. He gestures to two doors next to each other, then addresses Bucky and Peter. Figured you'd probably want to be next to each other, so these rooms are yours if you want them. They're guest rooms, so they're pretty sparse, but I'm sure you're used to that. The fuck is that supposed to mean? Bucky says, noting the way Stark's face pales a little, looking slightly mortified, like he wasn't expecting those words to come out of his mouth either. He schools his features, though, and changes his tone for a more jovial, humorous one as he replies, It means I've seen the inside of your apartment, and also that luckily for you, there's an actual bed in that room that your giant ass will fit in. He turns to Peter and smiles again. And you'll actually get your own bed, too. Peter says in a small voice, glancing at the door like it's a ticking bomb. Thanks, Mr. Stark. Bucky puts his arm around Peter's shoulder, feels the muscles relax slightly as Peter leans into him. He wants to tell Peter that it's alright, that he doesn't have to do anything he doesn't want to do, that they're safe here, and the separation of having different rooms isn't as bad as it feels. But he knows, too, that this whole situation is one he can't control. And the fear of making a promise he can't keep keeps his mouth shut. The awkwardness of earlier doesn't diminish as the day goes on. The atmosphere between the four of them is tense and uncomfortable, even when Stark leaves to buy provisions to restock the fridge with, and returns later with dinner, which no one is really in the mood to eat. Bucky's aware that Peter hasn't had anything to eat since breakfast early that morning, so he makes sure the boy ingests as much as he can, even though he chews slowly and unhurried, drastically unlike him. He knows just how terrified Peter must be, suddenly removed from their home like this, surrounded by people who want to separate them, and who know about Spider-Man's identity. Of course, he didn't tell Peter about Steve's comments on the plane, hasn't had a chance, even if he wanted to, because he knows that would only cement the kids' fears that they might be taken away from each other, and that's the last thing Peter needs. Dinner drags on until the late evening, and when it's over, the exhaustion of the day comes creeping in with a vengeance. When Peter has trouble keeping his eyes open, Bucky puts his hand on the kid's back and begins leading him to his room, shooting Steve and Stark a pointed look in the hopes that they'll stay put and not linger behind them like they have been all day. The room he takes Peter to is enormous, easily as big as their entire apartment. and with its own ensuite bathroom as well. Peter blinks owlishly at the large, pristinely made bed, and Bucky comfortably pats him on the back while gently urging him forward, encouraging him to lie down.
"You've had a long day, huh, kiddo?"
he asks, taking in the kid's anxious posture. There's a tightness in Peter's face that sets off an alarm in Bucky's gut, like watching a dam that's about to break.
"Are you all right?"
"Yeah," Peter quietly answers, looking at the enormous bed, intimidated. Bucky frowns and ruffles his hair, not used to Peter being too caught up in his feelings to talk about them.
"It was pretty scary,"
he says, trying to encourage the boy to open up.
"Especially back at the apartment. I nearly had a heart attack when I saw Steve there with you."
"Yeah," Peter says again, but lighter, a little laugh in his voice. "So did I."
"Did he say anything to you?"
Bucky asks, suddenly overcome with a need to know what could have possibly come out of Steve's mouth when he saw a kid alone in Bucky's apartment. Peter's smile widens and he looks down at the floor like he can't believe what he's about to say. He laughs again, glancing up at him while trying to get a hold of his expression. "He walked in and saw me kneeling behind the counter and he said, 'Oh, sorry, I must have the wrong apartment.' I kind of went into shock and didn't know what to say. Then you came in." Bucky shakes his head, smiling at the little laugh Peter makes as he kicks off his shoes and shimmies out of his jeans.
"That sounds like him,"
he says as the boy lies down.
"Anyway, you should try and get as much sleep as you can."
"What about you?" Peter asks quietly, crawling under the covers and curling up on the pillow.
"I'll be right next door,"
Bucky says softly, brushing Peter's bangs off of his forehead.
"You can come and wake me up if you need to, okay? Then get some sleep."
"'Kay," Peter mumbles, closing his eyes and relaxing into the mattress, but Bucky can see the tenseness in his neck and shoulders, the stress in his small hand clenched into a ball around the edge of the covers. Bucky lets his thumb swipe across the boy's temple one more time before he stands up, turns off the lights, and makes his way back to the living room where Steve and Stark are standing, waiting for him. Steve looks anxious, standing between Bucky and the couches, like he isn't sure if he should sit down or not. Stark doesn't deliberate and leisurely sits on the large armchair, but Bucky can see the man's anxiety in his crossed legs, his bouncing foot. Tony Stark is almost capable of hiding his nervousness, but not quite. With a sigh and a slump of his shoulders, Steve braces himself for whatever it is he's decided he needs to say, and looks over at Tony as if garnering some strength at the sight of the man, before turning back to Bucky. "Buck, we have to talk about Peter." Buck's eyes narrow, but beyond that, he doesn't react. He knew this was coming the moment they stepped foot on that plane, and especially after their last conversation was interrupted. He glances back down the hallway in the direction of Peter's room, knowing the door is firmly shut and hoping that they're too far away for his enhanced hearing to pick up.
"Don't bother saying it,"
he says slowly, his tone even.
"I'm not giving him up."
"Buck, seriously," Steve pleads, rubbing his forehead, frustration evident in his tight features. "This is insane. It's bad enough you were in New York this whole time, but to find out you went and took in some kid off the streets when you're..."
"When I'm what?"
Bucky asks, defensive. Part of him wants to scream, "You don't know anything about us!" Because it's true. Steve doesn't know Bucky anymore, can't claim to understand him after the long decades of separation they've been through. Bucky isn't even the same person he was when they met 2 years ago in D.C. Peter made sure of that. The defensiveness in his voice clearly gives Steve pause, because he softens his expression back to the damn pitying look, his tone sickeningly gentle. "Like I said, Buck, I don't doubt how much you care about him. He obviously cares a lot about you, too. You guys are clearly attached, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you have to realize, after everything you've been through, after everything Hydra did, after everything they made you do, you have to realize that adopting a kid is not the solution." "The solution?"
"What exactly are you trying to solve, Steve?"
he says, knowing he's needling the man further into an actual fight, but too pissed off by his condescending bullshit to care.
"I'm not the same person I was in 1942.
He says slowly, staring directly into the other man's eyes.
"Peter doesn't solve that. You want to know what he does do?"
Bucky gestures down at himself, not missing the way Steve briefly glances at his metal hand in motion.
"He makes being the guy I am now a lot more bearable."
Bucky continues, dropping his arms.
"I didn't ask to adopt a kid. I sure as hell wasn't looking. But it happened anyway, and I'm not backing out now."
"Damn it, Buck!" Steve grits his teeth, agitated. You're dangerous! Please, if you won't do it for yourself, then do it for Peter.
Do what for Peter?
Bucky asks, almost raising his voice, but stopping himself at the last second from speaking too loudly. Peter doesn't need to hear this.
What do you want me to do? Kick him back out on the streets? You think that would be doing him any favors?
Steve's shoulders relax slightly, but Bucky's tense when the man gestures to Stark. Tony's offered to take care of him, Steve says gently, like it's the perfect solution, like he came up with just the right answer that they would all instantly agree on. He's offered to take him back to New York and look after him until he finds a new home.
I'm Peter's new home.
Bucky seethes, almost seeing red from how angry the smug look on Stark's fucking face makes him.
And nobody is taking him anywhere without me. I'm not backing down on this, Steve. You're not taking my kid.
And what if something happens? Steve snaps, angry now, rounding on Bucky like he's the infuriating one. What if you slip back into that mindset and hurt someone? What if you hurt him?
Or get him hurt.
Stark interjects, much calmer than Steve, but just as firm.
You clearly have people after you, and he's already shown that he isn't scared of jumping in front of a bullet to save your life.
The judgmental look on Stark's face almost makes Bucky sick to his stomach, but he doesn't take the bait the man is offering and instead forces his anger down as he turns back to Steve.
I would never hurt Peter, he says. I know that for a fact.
Steve eyes him, his face full of doubt. How can you know that?
Every time I see his face,
he says, voice steady, not nearly as surprised by the sincerity in his voice as Steve is. Bucky almost turns back to the hallway to where Peter's room is, the desire to see him suddenly overpowering. But Peter's not there, he's not within arm's reach, so Bucky steels his nerves and plants his feet, refusing to back down.
That's how I know. Hydra tried, Steve. They found us. The guy was one word away from turning me back into a killing machine, and Peter pulled me out of it. I broke out of my conditioning because that bastard hurt my son.
A look of surprise crosses Steve's face, layered with doubt, but Bucky's gaze flickers to Stark's stony, suspicious glare behind him, so he doubles down.
The guy was my old handler, and even he couldn't make me hurt that kid.
Your old handler? Steve cuts in, his brows furrowed together. Brock Romlo? Bucky raises an eyebrow at him, giving him a one-arm shrug.
Dunno, I never knew his name. Could barely even recognize him, his face was burned to shit.
Buck, he's dead, Steve says, no small amount of relief in his voice. He died in that suicide bombing in Lagos. The confusion must be apparent on his face because Steve gives him a small smile and continues, I've spent the last 2 years dismantling Hydra trying to find you. They're done for, Buck. We haven't found so much as a trace of any remaining factions in months. Doubt festers deep in his gut, shadowed by no small degree of alarm.
But I thought Hydra was the one who bombed the UN to flush me out.
Stark doesn't look convinced, but Steve shakes his head with a small shrug. Romlo was the final Hydra agent we had to track down. Every base is deserted, and every member with any kind of status whatsoever is either behind bars or dead. He looks up at Bucky then, his eyes apologetic and apprehensive in equal measure. It must have been someone else. He rubs his forehead with the cool metal of his left hand, his chest feeling tight. It was bad enough when he thought it was Hydra after him, the faceless, insidious thing that's been shadowing him for a lifetime. But to hear that that might not be the case, that there's someone else out there, even more unknown to him, hunting him down, raises the panic in Bucky's body to an almost unbearable level. Steve seems content to give him a moment to process this, but then Stark clears his throat and says, Not to beat a dead horse, but whether or not Hydra is the puppeteer here isn't really the issue. The two men lock eyes for a moment before Stark tears his gaze away from Steve and points it at Bucky. That fact remains that you have some pretty intense psychological programming rattling around inside your head that nobody knows how to remove. He says, not unkindly, but not with much sympathy either. And as long as you do, you aren't safe for Peter. For the first time, Bucky turns away from Steve completely, directing his reply solely at the other man, along with his cold, hard stare. Stark doesn't flinch, but his body goes very still, unable to hide how unnerved he is by Bucky's glare.
I'm only going to say this one more time,
Bucky says emphatically, the coldness of his voice contrasting with the heat of his rage.
I don't know who you think you are, Stark, but you have no right to act like you know anything about us.
He takes a step forward, ignoring Steve, his gaze boring into Tony's.
You have no right to say he isn't safe with me. I'm the one who took him in when every other adult in his life failed him. I'm the one who kept him from getting shot, who kicked the crap out of a predator when he tried to put his hands on him. I'm the one who stayed up all night drying off stray kittens when he brought them home. I'm the one who comforted him when he was sad, and praised him when he needed support, and held him when he was scared. I'm the one who nursed him back to health and fucking bathed him when he was too sick to move. The one who taught him how to defend himself. The one who exposed himself to Hydra in order to give him some semblance of a home.
He stops up close and personal now, advancing on the man as he spoke, leaning over him as he continues.
He is my son. He is 15 years old. You,
he snarls,
will never take him away from me.
Stark looks afraid, but his voice, to his credit, is steadier than Bucky expected.
Even if he is safe,
the man says, keeping their gazes locked,
he has no future with you. If you really cared about what's best for him, you'd be man enough to admit it.
Bucky's able to stop himself from physically shrinking away at the blow, held steady by his anger and his pride. He can't admit that Stark is right, that Bucky knows all too well just how much potential Peter has, how far he could go in the right environment, how bright his future would have been if Bucky hadn't been so screwed up. He knows better than Stark ever could just how badly he's holding Peter back, how much of a waste it would be to spirit the kid away to some rural part of the world where his talent and intelligence would fail to be nurtured. Bucky knows, because he's agonized over the thought countless times what he's depriving Peter of more than the kid could ever know. But in the end, Bucky always has and always will leave that choice up to Peter regardless of what he wants himself, and he tells Stark as much.
Maybe,
he says, standing back up,
but that's not up to you or me. That's his choice.
Stark's eyes widen slightly, and Bucky doesn't miss the hint of challenge shining in them, the undeniably competitive spark.
So if he told you he'd rather stay in New York without you, you'd let him? Of course I would.
Bucky says, hardening his glare, not liking the implication in Stark's tone one bit.
Despite whatever you think, Stark, the only thing I care about is his happiness.
Well, Stark says, sniffing indignantly as he turns his head away,
at least we agree on something.
Bucky raises an eyebrow at that, momentarily struck by the genuine remark, but his attention is stolen by Steve, who sighs and runs his hand over his face, exhausted.
Let's call it a night,
he says, eyeing both of them.
We might as well save this discussion until after we hear from T'Challa. Sure,
Tony says, clearly lying. The withering look Steve sends him all but confirms that. The man stands and stretches his back as he says,
I'll show you where your room is, Cap.
And then he turns back to Bucky.
Hopefully it goes without saying that Friday will immediately alert me if you said so much as a toe outside this building. I wasn't in Vienna,
Bucky says.
I'm not going anywhere until everyone knows that.
Steve's shoulders relax slightly, but Stark gives him an unconvinced look.
Well, thanks for your cooperation, I guess.
Bucky turns to head back down the hallway to his room, but stops, briefly glancing over his shoulder.
I'm not doing it for you.
And then he leaves the room, momentarily lingering outside Peter's door, before entering through his own. Peter's not a loud sleeper by any means, but the absence of the sounds of him sleeping makes Bucky's room seem deafeningly silent. There's a small sitting area across from his bed below the large bay window, and Bucky finds himself routinely looking over at the couch there, expecting to see a sleeping bag draped across it. But even though the position of the couch and his bed are right, everything else is all wrong. For one thing, the couch in this random guest's room sitting area is bigger than the one they have at home, angular compared to the rounded corners theirs has, pristine white instead of the grungy brown that was probably green once upon a time. Bucky lies there as long as he can stand it before his nerves and his restlessness drive him out of bed. He doesn't care if he's being observed, if Stark's creepy robot butler is going to record his every move to report back to Stark in the morning. If he has to lie still on this obscenely plush bed one more minute, he's going to lose his mind. He doesn't have to try to be quiet as he leaves the room. Moving silently comes naturally to him, which is probably a symptom of Hydra, but he can't remember a time when he didn't. He follows the hallway to the open kitchen and dining room, eyes easily scanning the room in the dark. His gaze is drawn to a sliver of light beyond the large glass doors leading to the deck, and as he steps closer, he notices it's the reflection of the sky on the water before him. The deck curves to the side to the backyard that is too dark to be seen, but it also stretches forward in a straight line, turning into a dock that rests on the water. The sky is so beautifully clear, devoid of light pollution of any kind, that it's bright and overflowing with stars, more than Bucky is sure he's ever seen in his life. Wanting to get the closer look, Bucky reaches out, but stops himself from grabbing the handle to the door just in time.
"Hey, how's what?"
he says, careful to not be too loud.
When Stark said no setting foot outside, I'm guessing that included the deck.
"It does," the AI replies gently. "While the deck is technically part of the building's structure, it is also considered to be an outdoor environment."
"So no fresh air?"
Bucky asks rhetorically, not really expecting an answer. He drops his hand from the door and decides to finish scoping out the rest of the building that isn't off limits when the AI pipes up and says, "I'm afraid I can't allow you onto the deck. However, if I could direct your attention to the window to your right," she says, and when Bucky follows her direction and looks at the wide, spacious bay window on the other side of the dining room, he watches in amazement as the window panes slide back on the front, sides, and top of the window, leaving it nothing more than a wooden ledge suspended over the water, boxed in by a thin mesh screen. Bucky approaches it cautiously, the cool breeze drifting in from the screens in front of, beside, and above him all at once, bringing with it the scent of water and clean forest air. The ledge is wide enough for Bucky to sit comfortably, with plenty of room to spare, and as he starts to climb onto it, he glances up through the screened-in top of the window above him, and is blown away by the crystal clear view of the galaxy. The sight is so startling and daunting that it almost makes him dizzy, but he swallows his amazement and numbly says,
Thanks."
"You're welcome, Sergeant Barnes." Bucky stops, blinking, and lifts an eyebrow as he glances around the room, not sure where to point a suspicious look.
"Did Stark tell you to call me that?"
he asks, feeling somewhat unnerved at the unfamiliar title and the queasiness it leaves in his stomach. "I am programmed to address Mr. Stark's guests by their legal titles." She's silent for a moment and adds, "But I can call you something else if you prefer." "Anything else?" Bucky thinks, resting his head against the window casing, suddenly struck by the memory of an awful face peering down at him, smiling, the light shimmering off of his glasses. "Good morning, Sergeant Barnes." Hands on his skin, warm and damp, closing around the barely healed socket of where his left arm used to be. "Shall we continue where we left off?" Bucky takes a deep breath and tries to say,
"Call me Bucky."
but it comes out as a broken whisper, too defeated and ragged to be heard surely. But the AI makes an odd beeping noise above him, then softly says, "As you wish, Bucky." And he releases the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and sinks down onto the window ledge the stars forgotten. His left arm fists into the front of his shirt, stretching the fabric irreversibly. His mind is a mess all of a sudden, a swarm of disconnected words, all smacking together as they swirl inside his head. "I'm Bucky. I'm Bucky," he urgently tells himself, forcing the thoughts through the impenetrable storm, trying to give them shape, make them true. "I'm Bucky." But it doesn't feel right. It feels untrue, unlike a lie. It feels like a fact that's been changed, the old version of a new reality. "I'm Bucky!" His eyes shoot open at the sound of a door opening, followed by the creak of footsteps rooms away down the hall. Bucky heaves in a couple of deep, much-needed breaths as he turns his head in the direction of the noises, his mind blanking at the light sound of tentative knocking. "Dad?" calls a quiet voice, and a door creaks as it's opened. "Dad?"
"Yeah, Peter, I'm here."
Bucky says instantly, pushing off the ledge of the bay window and moving toward the mouth of the hallway.
"I'm right here. Are you okay?"
Peter comes rushing down the hall, barely managing to stop before he barrels into him. "What are you doing out here? I went to your room and you weren't there."
"I came out here because I couldn't sleep. I was just taking a look around."
Bucky gently says, subconsciously taking Peter's shoulders in his hands to make sure the kid is okay. Peter's wide, terrified eyes setting his already shot nerves on edge. "Well, then leave a note or something! Don't just not be in your room!" Peter says, anxiety pouring off him, and the frightened sound of his voice, mixed with the ridiculousness of his request, actually manages to calm Bucky down.
"Hey,"
he says, cupping the back of Peter's head, running his fingers through his hair to soothe him.
"Hey, Peter, you're okay. What happened? Did you have a bad dream or something?"
Peter shakes his head, averting his eyes, looking somewhat embarrassed. I woke up and you weren't there," he says, his voice small. "And then my room felt really weird and way too big, and I just really wanted to see you." Bucky hugs him, feeling guilty despite the fact that he would never make Peter feel like this on purpose, and sympathetic because he knows exactly what Peter means, that in this backward situation the only thing they have that is familiar and any source of comfort is each other.
You can stay out here with me if you want,
he says, an idea coming to him.
Actually, yeah, come here, you'll love this.
He guides a quizzical Peter back over to the bay window and gestures for him to take a seat where the kid glances at him questioningly. Bucky smiles when the confused look deepens on Peter's face, and then he points upward and watches, grinning as Peter looks up, and his eyes widen in astonishment. Whoa! Peter's mouth opens in a silent gasp as he takes in the vast sky, brightened by trillions and trillions of glimmering white stars. His face is illuminated by the pale cold light settling down on them both, so Bucky can easily see the anxiety and stress in his features melt away to wonder, to amazement, and is the best feeling in the world.
Hang on a second,
he says as he walks over to the sitting area and grabs the throw blankets draped across the back of the armchairs, carrying them back over to the bay window, unnoticed by Peter, who still hasn't looked away from the sky once. Bucky smiles and wraps one of the blankets around his kid's shoulders, then takes his own seat in the corner of the ledge, Peter resting against his knees. This is amazing, Peter breathes, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. I didn't know stars actually look like this without a telescope. I thought it was just in movies. The smile on his face doesn't waver, but an insidious doubt crawls up the back of Bucky's neck, dampening the moment. He observes the gentle look on Peter's face, his wide-eyed gaze, his amazed smile, and feels a stab of shame as Stark's words come flooding back to him. He has no future with you. Part of him doesn't believe it, because he knows Peter, and Peter has a future no matter where he ends up. That's the kind of person he is. His genius, his work ethic, his compassion. He's the kind of person who makes everything around him better. If he ended up in a backwards village with dirt roads and a single well, Bucky doesn't doubt for a second that Peter would make it a paradise, smiling the whole time. That's the goodness of Peter, really, in a way that Bucky has never seen before. He makes everything he touches better, like magic, born of an inherent desire to do good and the drive to bring that good to life. He's the opposite of Bucky, who has only wrecked everything he's ever laid his hands on, and it burns him up inside that Tony Stark knows it. His attention is brought back when Peter lightly shivers, and he rests his metal hand on the kid's shoulder, gently tugging him when he looks at him.
Come here,
he says softly, and turns Peter so his back is to his chest. More than enough room on this ridiculously spacious window ledge for Peter to sit between his legs, curled up against his chest, one blanket wrapped around his shoulders and the other laid across their laps. Peter sighs deeply and relaxes in Bucky's hold, pulling his arms tighter around him contentedly. Bucky rests the back of his head against the wall, tipping his head back to look up at the stars, Peter's hair tickling his throat as the boy does the same.
Peter,
Bucky says quietly, hating the words about to come out of his mouth.
You don't have to be here if you don't want to be.
Peter tenses. What do you mean?
You could go home,
he says, hugging him tighter.
To New York. You could stay in school and wait for this to blow over until I can come back to you.
A long silent moment passes between them, and Bucky is sure that the next word out of Peter's mouth is going to be okay, or some other variation of agreement. But what Peter actually does is take a watery breath, voice on the edge of tears, and sadly whisper, I can't go home.
What do you mean?
Bucky asks, reluctantly letting Peter sit up and turn around, hating his son's crushed look and the sight of his wet eyes. To our apartment, Peter says a little firmer. The Queen's. You don't get it. Why would I go back there without you? They're just places now. His eyes brim with tears, but he fights with everything he has to keep them from falling. It was the same thing when Ben and May died. They took me to the apartment to grab my stuff, and everything looked different. It was just a room with things in it, even though I'd grown up there, and it was the only home I remembered. It wasn't home anymore. Peter reaches forward and trails his fingers along the grooves and indentations of Bucky's metal hand, resting on his knee, absent-mindedly, like he isn't aware he's doing it. Bucky flips his hand over so the back is resting on his kneecap, palm up, so he can feel Peter's small hand outline the metal better. It would be the same thing if I went back to our apartment now, Peter says, sniffling. It'd be the same thing if I went back into foster care or stayed with Ned or anybody else. It'd just be places filled with things and people. It wouldn't be home. He looks up at him then, so stubborn, but begging Bucky to understand. We could go to Mongolia and live in a yurt, and that would be home, because you'd be there. Bucky closes his hand around Peter's, relishes in the warmth that spreads through his fingers.
I do get it, Peter,
he says, coaxing him back into his arms, hugging him even tighter against his chest.
You aren't the only one who feels like that. It's the same for me. The world was just a place filled with people until I found you.
Peter hugs him, and Bucky lets his cheek rest against the top of the boy's head, feels the brush of his soft curls against his skin.
I was just existing until I met you, and now the only thing I give a damn about is making sure you're happy and healthy and safe. I'd give my right arm to avoid being separated from you, but I'd do it if it's what you wanted.
It's not what I want, Peter begs, voice layered with tears again. I don't care where we are, Dad. I just want to stay with you.
You're staying with me,
Bucky promises, wrapping the boy in his arms and hugging him, holding him against his chest, rocking him gently.
You're staying right next to me, kiddo. I promise.
Peter curls up tighter in his arms, sniffling, and Bucky shushes him and wraps the blanket around him again, his metal fingers lacing in the boy's soft head of hair as he cradles him. Eventually, Peter relaxes, head against Bucky's shoulder, his arms and legs lax, spread across Bucky's own, his breathing silent and even in the depths of sleep. Bucky waits a little while longer, just enjoying the moment while it lasts. The gentle breeze across the water, the sky full of stars above them, Peter peaceful and safe in his arms. Then he slowly threads his arm under the boy's legs and lifts him bridal style into his arms, carrying him delicately out of the room and back down the hallway to the boy's bedroom. Peter softly sighs as Bucky lays him down, but makes no other sound or sign of waking, so he pulls the blankets back over his small body and tucks him in, kneeling beside the bed as he brushes the hair away from his eyes. Peter curls up tighter on his side, nestling into the pillow, and Bucky smiles and presses a quick kiss to his temple, his head full of thoughts of how much he loves this kid, and all the good and bad things that come along with that. The joy, the fear. Finally, he stands back up, giving Peter's head one last gentle pat before he turns to leave and stops at the sight of Steve standing in the doorway, watching him, his face unreadable. Bucky stares back, trying to make sense of the look on Steve's face and the fact that he managed to sneak up on him, but then Steve silently nods his head down the hall, walking away, gesturing for Bucky to follow him.